Hey there. Before we begin tonight, I just want to say, if you found this video, I'd love to know how. Drop a comment below and tell me where you first heard about History to Unwind. It genuinely means a lot to know how this little corner of the internet finds its way to you. And if you enjoy what we do here, calm, unhurried, carefully researched stories from history, consider liking this video and subscribing. Not because you feel obligated to, but only if this is the kind of place you'd like to come back to. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already, maybe pull a blanket over your legs, and let tonight's story carry you gently somewhere unexpected. Because tonight, we're going to correct one of history's most stubborn, most repeated, and most thoroughly wrong assumptions about the past. Tonight, we're going to talk about soap, and bathhouses, and toothbrushes made from hazel twigs, and the 32 public baths of 13th century Paris. And why, when you actually look at the historical evidence, the medieval world was far, far cleaner than anything you've seen in a Hollywood film. There is a version of the Middle Ages that lives in our collective imagination, a version so deeply embedded that most people have never questioned it. It goes something like this. The streets ran with waste. The peasants never bathed. The nobles wore perfume to cover the smell of bodies they hadn't washed in months. And the general atmosphere of any medieval town was somewhere between a barnyard and a sewage ditch. The people were dirty, the places were dirty, and everyone simply accepted this as an unremarkable fact of life, the way we accept traffic jams or bad weather. That version of history is not history. It is a myth. And it has a surprisingly specific origin, one that says much more about the people who invented it than about the people it claims to describe. The idea that medieval Europe was uniquely, catastrophically filthy was largely a product of Renaissance and Victorian thinkers who needed a contrast for their own imagined enlightenment. Renaissance scholars, eager to announce the rebirth of civilization, drew a sharp and convenient line between themselves and everything that had come before. The Middle Ages became a placeholder for everything they wanted to leave behind. Darkness, ignorance, superstition, and yes, dirt. If the Renaissance was the dawn of clean, rational modernity, then the preceding centuries had to be its opposite. Muddy, unthinking, reeking of the unenlightened past. Victorian historians amplified this portrait with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. The 19th century was, paradoxically, a period of genuine sanitation crisis. Industrial cities were extraordinarily polluted. Working-class housing was genuinely overcrowded and underserved. And yet Victorian writers projected their fears about their own world backward onto the medieval one. The Middle Ages became a screen onto which the anxieties of modernity could be projected. And then came Hollywood, which did what Hollywood does. It took a lazy shorthand and turned it into a visual vocabulary. Every film, every television series, every fantasy adaptation reinforced the same image. Mud-caked peasants with rotting teeth, straw-filled streets, great feasting halls reeking of unwashed bodies and meat gone bad. The movie version of medieval life became the version most people carry in their heads today. The problem is that archaeology, primary sources, and careful historical scholarship tell a completely different story. Let us begin somewhere quiet, with a morning in 13th century Paris. And, lest we think this was exclusively an urban phenomenon, available only to city dwellers with coin to spare, the evidence suggests otherwise. In Bamberg, Germany, records from 1480 showed that the local steam bath charged 1 heller, half a pfennig, for admission. A pfennig was itself a very small denomination of coin, roughly the kind of thing a person might earn doing an hour of unskilled work. The steam bath in Bamberg was not for the wealthy. It was for everyone. Some towns went even further. There are records of municipalities that fined citizens who failed to visit the bathhouse on a regular basis, treating lack of hygiene not as a personal matter but as a civic responsibility, something owed to one's neighbors as much as to oneself. This brings us to a question worth sitting with for a moment. If public bathing was this widespread, this accessible, this woven into the fabric of medieval daily life, Why do so many people believe the opposite? Part of the answer involves what survives and what doesn't. The records of medieval bathhouses, their guild registrations, their tax payments, the street crier announcements mentioned in passing by scholars exist. But they're not the kind of sources that make their way into popular history. What makes its way into popular history are the vivid, dramatic, memorable images: plague, famine, religious violence. The clean and the ordinary are always less likely to be remembered than the extraordinary. A city of 32 bathhouses is less dramatic than a city swept by pestilence. Part of the answer also involves what people needed to believe. A society that has decided it represents progress requires a before to contrast with. The Middle Ages, endlessly recycled as a stand-in for the unenlightened past, served that narrative purpose too conveniently to be abandoned in favor of the more complicated truth. And part of the answer is that some aspects of medieval urban life genuinely were difficult by modern standards. And lest we think this was exclusively an urban phenomenon, available only to city dwellers with coin to spare, the evidence suggests otherwise. In Bamberg, Germany, records from 1480 show that the local steam bath charged 1 heller, half a pfennig, for admission. A pfennig was itself a very small denomination of coin, roughly the kind of thing a person might earn doing an hour of unskilled work. The steam bath in Bamberg was not for the wealthy. It was for everyone. Some towns went even further. There are records of municipalities that fined citizens who failed to visit the bathhouse on a regular basis, treating lack of hygiene not as a personal matter, but as a civic responsibility, something owed to one's neighbors as much as to oneself. This brings us to a question worth sitting with for a moment. If public bathing was this widespread, this accessible, this woven into the fabric of medieval daily life, why do so many people believe the opposite? Part of the answer involves what survives and what doesn't. The records of medieval bathhouses, their guild registrations, their tax payments, the street crier announcements mentioned in passing by scholars exist, but they're not the kind of sources that make their way into popular history. What makes its way into popular history are the vivid, dramatic, memorable images: plague, famine, religious violence. The clean and the ordinary are always less likely to be remembered than the extraordinary. A city of 32 bathhouses is less dramatic than a city swept by pestilence. Part of the answer also involves what people needed to believe. A society that has decided it represents progress requires a before to contrast with. The Middle Ages, endlessly recycled as a stand-in for the unenlightened past, served that narrative purpose too conveniently to be abandoned in favor of the more complicated truth. And part of the answer is that some aspects of medieval urban life genuinely were difficult by modern standards. The absence of centralized sewage systems, the presence of animals in city streets, the contamination of certain water sources. These things were real, but the leap from medieval sanitation had real challenges. To medieval people were categorically filthy and indifferent to cleanliness is an enormous one, and it is not supported by the evidence. Let us talk about soap. The history of soap in medieval Europe is richer, more geographically varied, and more technically sophisticated than most people suspect. Soap, in its basic form, a compound made by reacting fats or oils with an alkaline substance, had been produced and used in various forms since antiquity. But medieval Europe significantly advanced both its production and its availability. The soap that first transformed European bathing culture came from the east. Aleppo, in what is now northern Syria, had been producing a distinctive high-quality soap since ancient times. Aleppo soap was made from 2 oils, olive oil and the oil pressed from the berries of the laurel tree, combined through a careful cold process method. The result was a dense, fragrant bar that lathered generously, cleansed gently, and carried with it a faint herbal scent. When Crusaders passed through the eastern Mediterranean in the 11th and 12th centuries, they encountered this soap and brought the tradition and the raw materials back with them. It was not the only thing the Crusades transferred westward, but it was one of the more pleasant ones. From the 13th century onward, Marseille emerged as a major center of European soap production, drawing on olive oil from Provence and maritime trade connections that brought in additional ingredients. Savon de Marseille, Marseille soap, became a commercial product of real significance, traded through the markets of southern France and eventually across much of Europe. Its success inspired parallel developments in Spain and Italy. Castile in central Spain, though one with a less agreeable smell than its olive oil counterparts. Bristol, Coventry, and London all had documented soap-making industries by the late medieval period. The product was used, it was bought and sold. It was not exotic. There is a quote from the ancient Roman physician Galen, writing about the Germanic tribes he encountered, that sometimes gets pressed into service by those who wish to argue that cleanliness in Northern Europe is a modern development. Galen noted that the Germans used soap, a Germanic product made from animal fat and ashes, and that it was quite effective at cleaning the skin. He meant it as something of a neutral observation. Medieval Germans, reading such a passage centuries later, might have taken it as a kind of ancestral pride. Their people had known about soap for a very long time. The bathing practices of the Vikings deserve their own moment of attention because they complicate the popular image of Norse culture even more thoroughly than most people expect. The Vikings are often portrayed as wild, fearsome, and emphatically unclean. Warriors who smelled of blood and sea salt and were proud of it. This image, like the image of the filthy medieval peasant, is almost entirely a fiction. In Old Norse, Saturday had a specific name, lagerdager. The word is sometimes translated as wash day, and it referred to the Norse practice of reserving Saturday, or at least part of Saturday, for bathing and personal grooming. This was not universal or perfectly observed in every household, but it was a recognized cultural tradition, embedded in the very name of the day of the week. Archaeological excavations of Viking-age sites have turned up combs with remarkable frequency. They appear in graves, both men's and women's graves, placed as personal possessions alongside weapons and jewelry. The combs are made from antler, bone, and ivory, often finely decorated, clearly valued objects. This is not the detritus of a people indifferent to personal grooming. A comb placed in a grave suggests that its owner used it regularly, valued it, and was believed to have some use for it even in whatever lay beyond. Perhaps the most remarkable testament to Viking cleanliness comes not from Norse sources, but from their enemies. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles and various English accounts from the 9th and 10th centuries contain complaints about the Vikings that modern readers do not expect. English writers noted, with what appears to be genuine resentment, that Norse men combed their hair regularly, bathed often, and changed their clothes with a frequency that English observers found almost excessive. There is a remarkable passage suggesting that Viking men attracted English women away from English men, partly through the unfair advantage of being clean. Whatever one makes of the politics of that claim, it preserves something genuinely interesting. The perception, recorded by contemporaries, that the Vikings were unusually attentive to personal cleanliness. That reputation was not entirely one-sided. Later, Scandinavian sources also describe elaborate bathing rituals, steam baths dug into the earth or constructed from timber, similar to the Finnish sauna tradition that persists to this day. Water would be heated, steam would be generated by pouring it over hot stones, and the bathers would sweat, scrape, and rinse in a sequence that cleansed both body and spirit. These were not exceptional events. They were part of the regular rhythm of domestic and communal life. Now let us move inside, into the stone corridors of the medieval monastery, where the relationship between cleanliness and spiritual life takes on a particular character. Monasteries were, in many ways, the most hygienically sophisticated institutions in medieval Europe. This surprises people, because popular culture tends to picture monks as either unwashed ascetics in rough wool robes, indifferent to bodily comfort in pursuit of spiritual purity, or as clandestine hedonists hiding pleasures behind their walls. Neither image captures the reality. The Benedictine rule, the foundational document of Western monasticism, written in the 6th century by Saint Benedict of Nursia, contains remarkably specific guidance about hygiene. Monks were to wash regularly, maintain clean clothing, and care for their bodies as the vessels through which God's work was done. The rule made provisions for bathing as often as is expedient, a phrase that sounds vague, but which in practice meant that regular bathing was built into monastic life. Baths were prescribed around major feast days, and for the sick and elderly, more frequently. Cluny Abbey in France, one of the most powerful and influential monasteries of the medieval world, had, at its height, a bathhouse containing 12 individual tubs. Adjacent to it were 45 toilet cubicles arranged along water-flush channels, a form of running water sanitation that would not have seemed out of place in a Roman building, and that far exceeded the standards of most secular establishments of the same era. The engineering behind monastic water systems was genuinely impressive. Many monasteries built elaborate networks of lead pipes, ceramic conduits, and wooden channels to bring fresh water in from springs or rivers and direct wastewater away from the living quarters. The water systems at Christ Church Cathedral Priory in Canterbury, documented in a 12th century plan that survives to this day, show an intricate network of pipes supplying fresh water to the kitchen, the lavatorium where monks wash their hands, the infirmary, and the bathhouse, with separate channels for drainage. The monks of Canterbury were not improvising. They were engineers. Hand washing before meals was not merely encouraged in monastic communities. It was ceremonially required. A monk who came to the refectory table without washing his hands had violated not just etiquette, but religious observance. The lavatorium, a large communal basin near the entrance to the dining hall, was a fixture of every properly built monastery. Its presence is architecturally essential as the chapel or the dormitory. There is a small tradition of early Christian asceticism that did involve deliberate rejection of bathing. Certain desert fathers in the Eastern tradition who adopted filth as a form of mortification, as a deliberate denial of bodily pleasure. Saint Fintan of Clonina reportedly bathed only once a year for a period of 24 years. Thomas Becket, when his vestments were removed after his murder at Canterbury, was found to be wearing a hair shirt infested with lice, an extreme act of private penance that his admirers interpreted as evidence of hidden holiness. These cases were remarkable precisely because they were exceptional. They were recorded as extraordinary acts of ascetic devotion, not as ordinary behavior. The medieval church did not teach that avoiding bathing was virtuous. Pope Gregory the Great explicitly described bathing as a legitimate bodily need, something Christians could and should attend to without guilt. The ordinary practice of medieval Christian life, as documented in monastic rules, household manuals, and medical texts, involved regular washing, not its avoidance. Before we leave the monastery entirely, there is one more dimension worth pausing over. Medieval monks were also, in many cases, the most sophisticated medical practitioners of their age. Monastery infirmaries housed the sick, trained healers, and maintained libraries of medical texts that preserved and transmitted Greco-Arabic medical knowledge. These healers connected physical cleanliness directly to physical health in ways that were conceptually sophisticated, even if the underlying mechanisms were not yet understood in modern terms. Medieval medical theory, rooted in the four-humor system inherited from Greek medicine and significantly elaborated by Islamic scholars like Avicenna and Averroes, held that the body maintained health through a proper balance of internal conditions. Bathing played a specific therapeutic role in this framework. Hot baths were understood to open the pores, release built-up impurities, and restore equilibrium to a body that had fallen out of balance. Cold water was prescribed for fever and inflammation. Steam was recommended for respiratory ailments. The physician Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who wrote extensively on natural medicine, described bathing in nuanced terms, outlining which temperatures of water were appropriate for which conditions, which herbs added to bath water could treat specific ailments, and which patients were too fragile to benefit from full immersion and should instead be washed with cloths soaked in medicated water. This was not folk wisdom scrawled in margins. It was the authoritative medical position of the medieval period, taught in the few medical schools that existed, and practiced in hospital environments attached to monasteries across Europe. The connection between washing and health was not a modern invention. It was an ancient observation, refined through centuries of practice, and embedded in the most advanced medical thinking available to medieval Europe. Let us walk away from the monastery now and into something more intimate. The question of how ordinary medieval people maintain their bodies from day to day, without access to bathhouses or monastic plumbing. The answer is carefully and consistently within the constraints of their circumstances. For most medieval people, daily hygiene centered on what was sometimes called top and tail washing, the regular cleaning of the face, hands, underarms, and genitals using a basin of water and a cloth. This was not a full bath, but it was not nothing. It was a deliberate, regular practice that most adults would have performed every morning as a matter of course. Medieval household manuals, the equivalent of etiquette guides, are clear about this. Washing one's face and hands upon rising was described as basic, unremarkable, expected behavior. Washing hands before eating was not merely good manners, but a near-universal custom rooted in practical necessity. Medieval people ate with their hands, or with knives that had been handling other foods all day. Contaminated hands at the table were a genuine health risk. The ritual of hand-washing before meals appears in household records, monastic rules, accounts of royal banquets, and travelers' descriptions of ordinary village life. Large households kept basins and ewers specifically for this purpose. At formal feasts, servants circulated with water, towels, and sometimes scented rinsing solutions. Medieval physicians, drawing on the Greco-Arabic medical tradition that formed the backbone of medieval medical education, were consistent in their recommendation of regular bathing as a health measure. Medical texts describe the proper temperature for bathing water, the ideal duration of a bath, the circumstances under which bathing should be avoided, immediately after a heavy meal, for instance, or when the patient was feverish, and the herbs and minerals that could be added to bath water to treat various ailments. These were not folk remedies scrawled in margins. They were the mainstream positions of the most educated medical thinkers of the age. The question of oral hygiene in the medieval world is one that surprises people most consistently, because the image of rotting medieval teeth is so strongly embedded in popular consciousness. The reality is more nuanced. Medieval dental health was genuinely worse than modern dental health in one important respect. The foods available in the medieval diet, particularly for ordinary people, were low in refined sugar. Sugar was expensive, rare, and consumed primarily by the wealthy in small quantities. Tooth decay caused by dietary sugar was therefore far less common among medieval peasants than it would be among their modern counterparts eating industrially produced food. Archaeological analysis of medieval skeletal remains consistently shows that peasant tooth decay was, in fact, much lower than in populations after the widespread adoption of sugar. But medieval people did not simply ignore their teeth. There is substantial evidence of deliberate oral hygiene practices across the medieval period. Teeth were cleaned using hazel twigs whose ends had been chewed until the fibers separated into something resembling a brush. Hazel was widely available, easily gathered, and had mild astringent properties. Cloths made from rough wool or linen could be used to rub the teeth and gums, a practice described in various household and medical texts. Herbal mouth rinses, made from mint, sage, rosemary, vinegar, or combinations thereof, were used to freshen breath and treat gum problems. The Anglo-Saxon medical tradition preserved recipes for mouth treatments that combined herbs with honey, wine, and mineral salts. Medieval herbalists and physicians showed awareness of the connection between oral health and overall well-being. Chewing certain herbs, mint, fennel, anise, was understood to improve the smell of the breath and support dental health. These were not magical remedies. Mint genuinely does have mild antimicrobial properties. Fennel genuinely does reduce mouth odor. Medieval people observed these effects and acted on them, even without a biochemical framework for understanding why they worked. Beyond the teeth, Hair care was another area where medieval evidence defies the stereotype. The frequency of combs in archaeological finds, mentioned above in the context of Viking culture, but equally true throughout medieval Europe, points to regular, deliberate hair maintenance. Medieval women in particular took considerable care of their hair. Long hair on women was a cultural ideal across most of medieval Europe, and maintaining long hair in clean, presentable condition required consistent attention. Regular combing to prevent tangling and detect lice. Washing, sometimes the application of herbal rinses or oils, perfumes and scented products, played a significant role in medieval personal care, particularly from the later medieval period onward, as contact with the Islamic world increased. Rosewater, used as a fragrant rinse for both body and hair, was an import that became widely available through trade with the Near East. Lavender, used fresh and dried, was packed into bedding and clothing to repel insects and add fragrance. Medieval households in which people could afford a few luxury items often kept sachets of dried lavender or other herbs for precisely this purpose. There is another category of evidence that historians of medieval hygiene find particularly compelling, and that deserves a moment of attention before we move on. The physical objects themselves. Medieval archaeology regularly turns up the tools of personal care in quantities and contexts that tell a quiet but insistent story. Ear scoops, small implements designed to clean the ears, appear in medieval deposits across England, France, and Scandinavia. Tweezers for removing unwanted hair were common personal accessories, sometimes found attached to belt fittings, alongside knives and keys, as everyday carry items. Nail cleaning implements appear in household inventories and archaeological finds. Specialized vessels. The English word wardrobe itself is thought by some scholars to derive from these very spaces, because clothing was sometimes hung in the cold, drafty passages near guardrobes. The ammonia from waste deterring the moths and lice that plague stored fabric. Whether or not this etymology is precisely accurate, it captures something true. The garderobe was a functional, considered space, not an afterthought. Deep wells were another area where medieval engineering showed sophisticated concern about contamination. Beeston Castle in Cheshire, England, had a well that descended more than 124 meters into the rock, one of the deepest wells in England. The effort required to dig and line such a structure was enormous. No community digs a well 124 meters deep out of indifference to the quality of its water supply. They dig it because they understand, at some level, that depth is protection. That deeper water, farther from the surface and from the contaminants that collect there, is safer to drink. Monasteries again deserve mention here. The channeled water systems described earlier served not just for bathing and hand washing, but for waste removal. The rear order, the communal toilet block attached to the dormitory in well-built monasteries, was positioned over running water channels or linked by pipes to drainage systems that carried waste away from the inhabited buildings. The monks were not simply hoping that waste would disappear. They were actively engineering its removal. Urban waste management was a more complicated story. London, Paris, and other major medieval cities struggled with the sheer density of population and animals in a confined space. The streets were shared by people, horses, pigs, dogs, and poultry. Market areas accumulated the offal of butchering. Tanneries, which processed animal hides using urine and dung, produced a smell that was noted and complained about by medieval contemporaries. The Fleet River in London became so contaminated by the trades conducted along its banks that medieval writers described it with genuine disgust. And yet even here, the response was not indifference. City authorities in London repeatedly issued ordinances requiring residents to clean the street frontage in front of their own properties. Rakers, the medieval equivalents of sanitation workers, were employed to remove waste from streets and transport it outside the city. The contents of urban cesspits, which accumulated the waste from privies and private homes, were regularly emptied by night soil men who carted it away to be sold as agricultural fertilizer. This was not a perfect system. By modern standards, it fell far short. But it was a system, organized, regulated, and enforced, reflecting a society that recognized the problem of urban waste and attempted, within the limits of available technology, to manage it. We come now to the question that most people think they know the answer to, and get most completely wrong. The Black Death, the catastrophic plague that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, killing between 30 and 60% of the continent's population in its first wave, is almost universally presented as the inevitable consequence of medieval filth. The story goes like this. People were dirty, their cities were filthy, and so disease found an easy home among them. This story is not supported by modern understanding of what the Black Death actually was, or how it actually spread. The Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Its transmission is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. But what is clear is this: personal hygiene and bathing habits had essentially nothing to do with it. For much of the 20th century, the standard explanation for plague transmission involved rats and their fleas. Infected rats would die, their fleas would seek new hosts, and human beings who were bitten by those fleas would contract the disease. The Fleet River in London became so contaminated by the trades conducted along its banks that medieval writers described it with genuine disgust. And yet even here, the response was not indifference. City authorities in London repeatedly issued ordinances requiring residents to clean the street frontage in front of their own properties. Rakers, the medieval equivalents of sanitation workers, were employed to remove waste from streets and transport it outside the city. The contents of urban cesspits, which accumulated the waste from privies and private homes, were regularly emptied by night soil men who carted it away to be sold as agricultural fertilizer. This was not a perfect system. By modern standards, it fell far short. But it was a system, organized, regulated, and enforced, reflecting a society that recognized the problem of urban waste and attempted, within the limits of available technology, to manage it. We come now to the question that most people think they know the answer to, and get most completely wrong. The Black Death, the catastrophic plague that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, killing between 30 and 60% of the continent's population in its first wave, is almost universally presented as the inevitable consequence of medieval filth. The story goes like this. People were dirty, their cities were filthy, and so disease found an easy home among them. This story is not supported by modern understanding of what the Black Death actually was, or how it actually spread. The Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Its transmission is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. But what is clear is this: personal hygiene and bathing habits had essentially nothing to do with it. For much of the 20th century, the standard explanation for plague transmission involved rats and their fleas. Infected rats would die, their fleas would seek new hosts, and human beings who were bitten by those fleas would contract the disease. This model is not wrong, but it has been significantly complicated by recent research. A 2018 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examined mortality data from various 14th century plague outbreaks and found that the rapid, intense spread of the epidemic was much better explained by human ectoparasites, specifically human body lice and human fleas, than by the rat flea pathway alone. Body lice and human fleas can transmit Yersinia pestis directly from person to person, and their transmission dynamics fit the historical mortality patterns much more closely than rat-borne transmission models do. There are also significant problems with the rat hypothesis as the primary explanation. Archaeological evidence from medieval London plague sites shows little evidence of the mass rat die-offs that would be expected if rats were the primary reservoir and vector. The European climate during the 14th century was too cold and too variable to support the kind of large, stable rat population needed to sustain endemic plague, and the timing of plague peaks, occurring in summer, not in the cooler months when rat flea populations are most active, is inconsistent with rat-based transmission. What does this mean for the hygiene narrative? It means that even if medieval people had bathed more, their baths would not have saved them. The pathogen was spreading through networks of trade and human contact, through the lice that lived in everyone's clothing, regardless of their personal bathing habits, and through a respiratory form of the disease, pneumonic plague, that spread through the air during coughing. Soap does not stop aerosol transmission. Clean skin does not protect against inhaled bacteria. The Black Death was not a punishment for medieval filth. It was a catastrophic pandemic caused by a specific bacterium, spread through specific biological mechanisms, arriving in a population with no prior immunity and no effective treatment. It could have struck a population of immaculate bathers just as lethally, and in many ways, it did. Wealthy, well-fed, regularly bathed nobles died at comparable rates to the peasants who had less access to private tubs and more exposure to communal spaces. There is a heartbreaking irony here. One of the lasting legacies of the Black Death was the decline of the public bathhouse culture that had been a pillar of medieval urban hygiene for centuries. The scholar Erasmus, writing in 1526, recorded that 25 years ago, nothing was more fashionable than public baths, but that the plague had taught people to avoid them. He wasn't wrong. When people observed that disease seemed to spread through communal spaces, they began avoiding those spaces, even before they understood why. The bathhouses didn't close because medieval people were finally admitting what lazy hygiene avoiders they had always been. They closed because the plague made everyone afraid of proximity, afraid of touch, afraid of the shared water of a public basin. The medieval world's love of communal bathing ended not in filth but in terror, in the perfectly understandable, thoroughly tragic response of a population trying to survive a catastrophe they could not understand and could not control. Let us think now about what it actually meant to be clean in different parts of medieval society, because this was not a uniform experience, and the differences are illuminating. For ordinary peasants, access to bathing varied enormously by season, by proximity to water, and by the presence or absence of a local bathhouse. But the image of the peasant, as uniformly encrusted in the grime of endless toil, is not accurate. Peasants lived near rivers, streams, and ponds. They used these bodies of water for washing. Their bodies, their clothes, their tools. Basin washing was ordinary. Summer swimming in rivers served a hygienic as well as recreational function. The outdoor labor that supposedly covered medieval peasants in permanent filth also took place in proximity to water sources that made daily cleaning entirely feasible. Peasant clothing was laundered, though not with the frequency or efficiency of modern laundry. Clothes would be beaten, soaked, wrung, and dried. Lime made from wood ash served as a cleaning agent, an alkaline solution chemically similar in principle to modern detergents. The process was laborious, and in cold or wet weather it was difficult to dry clothing properly, but it happened. It was part of the regular domestic rhythm of medieval rural life, performed primarily by women as one of the central tasks of household management. For wealthy individuals and the nobility, bathing was not just common, it was occasionally ceremonial. Medieval accounts describe elaborate bathing rituals associated with important social occasions. A knight before his investiture, a bride before her wedding, wooden tubs lined with cloth to prevent splinters, filled with heated water carried in by servants, scented with herbs and oils, were a recognized luxury of noble households. King John of England, not a monarch remembered for his personal virtue, nonetheless traveled with a portable wooden bathtub, a fact documented in his household accounts. Edward III had hot and cold running water installed at Westminster Palace in the 14th century, a feat of medieval plumbing that most people would not expect until many centuries later. The bathing facilities available to the nobility were genuinely better than those available to peasants, not because nobles cared more about cleanliness, but because they had the resources to install private facilities and employ servants to maintain them. The medieval social hierarchy expressed itself in hygiene as it expressed itself in everything. The wealthy had more access to comfort and care, but the fundamental desire for cleanliness, the cultural expectation that a person should wash and be presentable, this was not a class distinction. It ran through medieval society from top to bottom. Medieval Jewish communities, whose religious law contained extraordinarily detailed requirements around cleanliness and ritual purity, maintained hygiene standards that exceeded those of the surrounding Christian population in many documented respects. Mikveh, ritual baths used for purification, were required features of any functioning Jewish community. These were not merely symbolic. They required genuine physical cleaning before immersion. The emphasis in Jewish law on washing hands before eating, on maintaining clean environments, on the ritual washing of the dead. These practices created communities where hygiene was a deeply embedded cultural and religious value, not an afterthought. The Islamic world's relationship with cleanliness, alluded to earlier in connection with ritual washing, extended far beyond individual practice. Islamic cities across the medieval world maintained elaborate public bath systems, the hammam, that served hundreds or thousands of users daily. The hammam was not simply a place to get clean. It was a social institution, a place of community, conversation, and commerce. Medieval travelers from Christian Europe who passed through Islamic territories frequently commented, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with discomfort, on the elaborate washing facilities they encountered, and on the extraordinary emphasis Islamic culture placed on personal hygiene. If we are to be honest about medieval hygiene, and this is a story about honesty, then we must acknowledge that medieval life did have genuine hygienic challenges. Urban areas, particularly in densely populated cities like London or Paris, faced real difficulties managing animal waste, human waste, and the byproducts of trades like tanning and butchering. Wells were sometimes contaminated. Rainwater collected in barrels could breed bacteria. The absence of modern plumbing infrastructure meant that water sources and waste disposal could come into close proximity in ways that created disease risk. But these challenges were known and opposed, not accepted with indifference. Medieval cities employed officials specifically responsible for maintaining clean streets and managing waste disposal. English records contain numerous prosecutions of individuals who dumped waste in public streets, blocked water channels, or let animals foul common areas. Medieval cities were not indifferent to the idea of sanitation. They simply had less effective tools for achieving it than modern cities do. What we must resist is the leap from medieval sanitation was imperfect by modern standards to medieval people were indifferent to cleanliness. The first statement is entirely true. The second is the myth that distorts our understanding of the past. Medieval people knew that dirty environments bred disease. They didn't have germ theory, but they had centuries of observation, codified in medical tradition, that connected filth, bad water, and bad air with illness. They acted on that knowledge within the limits of available technology. They built sophisticated water systems, maintained public baths, regulated food markets, buried their dead carefully outside of city limits, and developed elaborate social norms around personal cleanliness. The gap between what they understood and what we understand today is real, but it is a gap in knowledge and technology, not in values, not in desire, not in effort. The myth of the dirty Middle Ages, when we examine it carefully, tells us remarkably little about medieval Europe, and a great deal about the centuries that invented the myth. Every era needs a before, a contrast against which to measure its own supposed progress. The Renaissance needed a dark age. The Victorians needed a pre-modern past. Hollywood needed a backdrop of muck and chaos against which heroes could gleam. The medieval men and women who visited their city's bathhouses, who picked up their hazel twig toothbrush in the morning, who washed their faces and hands before eating, who kept dried lavender in their bedding and argued with their neighbors about the proper disposal of waste. They were not our ancestors in filth. They were people like us, doing their best within the circumstances available to them, caring about their bodies and their environments in ways that were, in most essential respects, entirely recognizable. They understood discomfort. They had no particular illusions about the difficulty of keeping clean in a world without running water. But they understood dignity too. They understood that the body mattered, that how you presented yourself to the world was a reflection of who you were. That cleanliness was not a modern virtue invented sometime after 1700, but a human one, ancient and persistent. The streets of 13th century Paris smelled of many things, but one of those smells, drifting out through the wooden doors of bathhouses where water had been heating since before dawn, was the clean, faintly herbal scent of soap. The bath criers were in the streets, the water was ready, and the city was rising. If tonight's story changed something about how you see the medieval world, or even just gave you something worth thinking about as you drift towards sleep, I'd genuinely love to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me what surprised you most. Tell me what you'd like to explore next. And if History to Unwind is the kind of company you want, on the evenings when you need to let the day go and when a voice in the dark telling you something true and unhurried is exactly what you need, I'd be glad to have you here. Like the video if it meant something to you. Subscribe if you'd like to come back. Sleep well tonight. The past is a kinder place than it's been given credit for.